So welcome back to another recitation session for part 5. Okay, so let's start with the first question. Mountain High Ice Cream Company transferred $60,000 of accounts receivable to a bank. The transfer was made without recourse. Okay, so there are two players here. Okay, so we have Mountain, okay, that is selling its accounts receivable, okay, receivable $60,000, okay, to a bank. Okay, there's a bank right there. Okay, all right. Prudential, the bank remits 90% of the factored amount to Mountain High. Okay, so the bank is remitting 90%. Okay and retains 10%. When the bank collects the receivables, it will remit to Mountain the retained amount less a 2% fee. Okay, 2% is the total factored amount, and then the remaining 10% has a fair value of $5,000. Okay, so record the journal entry. All right, so first thing that I want to calculate is the amount of cash that Mountain will receive from selling accounts receivable. So 90% times $60,000. So if I can bring up the calculator, 90% times $60,000. So today, Mountain will be getting $54,000. So we first debit cash. Okay, Mountain will get cash, $54,000. And then Mountain just sold accounts receivable at $60,000. Okay. All right. And then for the remaining 10%, okay, for the remaining 10%, the fair value of that was $5,000. Okay, $5,000. And then the fee will be applied for the remaining 10%. So the fee amount is 2%. So 2% times $60,000. So $1,012 is the amount of the fee. So let's subtract the fee amount. Okay, subtract fee. Oh my God, what's happening? $1,200. So we Mountain still have some receivables left. Receivable from factor. The amount is basically the difference between 5,000 and $1,200. 5,000 minus 1,200. So the remaining receivable is $3,800. Okay. All right. So at this point, let's calculate the total on the debit side and then the credit side. So credit side, $60,000. And then debit side, it is $57,800. So we will have to plug in 22, $2,200 on the debit side. So you will record the loss on the factoring arrangement. Okay, there you go. So debit cash, credit accounts receivable, receivable from factoring debit, and then loss on factoring, another debit. Okay, so this is the journal entry that you record. Okay, all right. Next, um, let's see what's happening here. So in this case, Mountain transferred $60,000 of accounts receivable. The transfer was made with recourse. Okay, so the bank remits 90% of the factored amount and retains the remaining 10%. The fair value of the remaining 10% is $5,000. And then recourse liability is $3,000. And then the fee is 2%. Okay. So we already did most of the calculations. Okay. So Mountain will get cash. It was $54,000. Okay. So $54,000. However, this fee, 2% fee, okay, requires that amount to be paid at the start of the factoring arrangement. So instead of applying this 2% fee on the remaining 10%, the fee will be actually paid upfront. So we are going to subtract $1,200 upfront from the cash advance. Okay. So the amount of cash that Mountain will receive is $52,800. Okay. All right. So the journal entry is actually going to be debit cash, $52,800. And then Mountain sold accounts receivable at $60,000. And then there is a receivable from factor. The last remaining 10% had a fair value of $5,000. So the remaining $5,000. And then there was a recourse liability. I might be obligated to make up the difference if the bank cannot collect at least 90% of that. Recourse liability, $3,000. Okay. And then at that point, we calculate the totals on the debit side and then the credit side. So debit side, $57,800. Credit side, $63,000. So we will have to plug in $5,200 on the debit side. So you are going to record a loss on factoring. Okay. So we have debit cash, we have credit accounts receivable, we have receivables from factor, debit, and then recourse liability credit, and then loss on factoring debit. Okay. So this will be the journal entry that you record. Okay. All right. Oops. Last question. Selkirk company obtained a $15,000 note receivable from a customer on January 1st. The note, along with interest at 10%, is due on July 1st, 2026. So I'm going to draw a timeline. Okay. So I have this notes receivable on January 1st, notes receivable $15,000. Okay. It is due July 1st. On February 28th, 2 months after, okay, 28th, 2 months after, the company discounted the note at a bank. So you sold your notes receivable. All right, but the discount rate is 12%. So the first thing that I want you to do is to record an adjusting entry on February 28th before the sale. Okay, so you accrue interest for the past 2 months. Okay, so let's calculate the amount of interest that you accrued for the past 2 months. So $15,000 times the interest rate 10% times 2 month period out of 12 month a year. Okay, so the amount of interest that you record or accrue is 15,000 times 10% times 2 divided by 12. That's $250. $50. So the adjusting entry that you record on February 28th is interest receivable. Okay. At maturity, I expect to collect $250 because that's the amount of interest revenue that you accrue, $250. Okay, so this is the first journal entry that you record. And then let's sell this notes receivable to this bank. Okay, so the first thing that I want to calculate is the amount of cash proceeds or cash advance that I'm going to be receiving. So for that, let's start with the total value of this note. Okay, so total value of this note is $15,000 plus the interest that will come with this note. Okay, so $15,000 times 10% interest rate, and this is a 6 months, okay, 6 months note. Okay, so 6 months out of 12 months a year. All right, so 15,000 times 10% times 6 divided by 12. So the total amount of interest that come with this note is $750. So the total value of this note is $15,750. Okay. All right. And then we are going to discount this note by 12%. In other words, we're going to calculate the amount of the fee that this bank will charge. Okay, so the fee amount is the total value $15,750. The discount rate or the fee rate is 12%. 4%. And then the bank will hold onto this note for the 4-month period. Okay, 4 months. From March 1st to July 1st, that's 4-month period. So 4 months out of 12 months a year. Okay. So 15,750 times 12% interest rate times 4 divided by 12. So the total amount of the fee is $630. Okay. All right. So we got the total value, we got the fee amount. Let's calculate the cash proceed, the cash that I'm going to be receiving. Okay. So total value $15,750 minus the fee amount 630. So today, okay, we are going to get 15,750 minus 630. $15,120. Okay, so the journal entry that you record is debit cash. We get cash from the sale, $15,120. And then let's sell this receivable, face value, $15,000. And then right before the sale, you recorded this $250 interest receivable. Since you're selling your note, you no longer will receive this $250. Okay, so credit interest receivable $250. Okay, so at this point, we get debit side 15,120, credit side 15,250. So we will have to plug in $130 on the debit side. So that's loss on sale. Okay. So this is the journal entry that you record when you sell your notes receivable to a bank. Okay. So let's take a look at here. Okay. All right. So that's all the exercise questions that we have for part 5. Okay. So keep up the great work. And then I look forward to seeing you on the next video.